Balcha, welcome back to Irish Granny Tarot. This is part 3 of our book, The Truth in the Light, by Peter and Elizabeth Fenwick. A very interesting exploration of the phenomenon of near-death experiences. We're on chapter 7. It wasn't my time to go. They all share a common experience of a decision point where people can decide to die or go back to life. 72% say that this decision is actively made. Half of them say it's their own decision, and then a lot of the others of them say that they're told, well, it's not your time, you have other things to do, go back. So there's a story here that I think is worth repeating. It actually has some kind of funny moments in it. So this happened on the birth of her first child in 1968. She was 34 years old. She was going in for an emergency operation, which I can only assume is a C-section. She says, I was facing the doors of the operating theater and I was aware that they were getting further and further away. Then I was coming out at the top of my head. It was as if my body was being rolled off me like a rubber glove. And I was coming out of my head. I was immediately in pitch darkness. To the right, I was still thinking logically. To the right above me was a small pinprick of light, and I was flying towards it. And at the time, I thought, my God, I'm dead. I was quite angry. I thought, it's not fair. I'm not even in the operating theater yet, and it's not going to be very easy for James, her husband. Oh, no, James is the baby. For James, I was sure my baby was going to be a boy, and I'd already chosen his name, James. It's not going to be easy for him if I'm dead in any way I don't want to die. I felt very annoyed by it. I got closer and closer to the light, which was getting bigger and bigger, and as I approached, I could see it showed up the walls of a tunnel. I flew towards it and emerged into it, and I was surrounded by it. I can't tell you how brilliant it was. There's no way to describe it. That's that inability to describe. It wasn't only the light, it was a feeling. I don't know what words to use, a feeling of exhilaration, joy, warmth. I was not afraid. It's nothing I've ever felt earlier or after. I became aware of what I can only describe as a being of light, and I heard a voice say, Jill, and I thought, heavens, it's God. Surely I can't come before God straight away. Surely there should be a sort of reception place or something. And the voice said, Jill, you know who I am? And I said, yeah, I do, but I can't stay. And the voice sort of chuckled and said, well, here is somebody you know. And there was another being of light. I didn't see anybody. I just knew it was there. And then I heard another voice, and I knew immediately it was my grandfather. We had had a very close relationship when I was a child, and he had died only 2 years before. I was so thrilled to be speaking to him again, and I said, Grandpa, I can't stay here. I've got to get back. I've just had a son, and Hamish has just got a new job, and he won't be able to cope with the new baby. I know there's a pile of ironing waiting to be done, and Hamish can't iron his own shirts. And my grandfather laughed and said, Jill, it doesn't matter a damn. You'll have to put up a better case than that. So I said, Grandpa, I'm only 34. I've got so much more to do with my life. I haven't had my money's worth. I want to go back. She had a long conversation with her grandfather in which she recounted all the things that had happened to her life, which were of value to her and which she felt could somehow be used to help other people. She then found herself on the operating theater, looking down on her body. I was very anxious to find Hamish and tell him I was coming back. So I went into the corridor. Now this is her consciousness floating. I went to the corridor and saw him sitting on a seat. I saw the doctor go out and speak to him and tell him we had a son, but that there were complications with me. Then Hamish went down the corridor to call my mother on the phone, and it was as if I could hear both sides of the conversation. She said, when you see her, keep talking to her, and in the meantime, pray. The next thing I knew, I was back in the ward, but still on the ceiling, and Grandpa was still with me. Hamish was sitting beside the bed. I didn't know how to get through to him to tell him I was all right. Then I saw an old-fashioned phone box. I thought if I press button B, it will get my money back, but I'll have to stay with Grandpa. So I pressed button A, and I heard Hamish say, hello, hello, and then I came round. Hamish says, we've got a son, and I said, yes, I know all about that. One more thing happened, which was very peculiar. My mother told me later that after Hamish had telephoned her, she had phoned her godmother, my great-aunt, and told her that she was worried about me. And my great-aunt had said, you don't have to worry about that. Harry is looking after her. Harry was my grandfather's name. I love that story. It's a great story. I love her saying, I have to go back. I haven't got my money's worth. So her family confirmed all these parts of her story that she said she saw. The phone conversation, her husband talking to her mother, all of that stuff. Not possible for her to have overheard this when she was unconscious, and too far for her to have heard it. This experience of being told it's not your time and you need to go back, and sometimes that they had unfinished business, family responsibilities. How could they be so logical and coherent at a moment where they're unconscious? Anoxia, I mean, it's incongruous. Some believe that they know that they're on a journey to death. Now, is this some sort of psychological response? People feel a duty to return, but they don't feel grief at leaving. It's like they have to go back because they have obligations, but they don't want to go back. Most don't mind the idea of leaving loved ones. Later on, they feel guilty that they weren't more concerned about their children and their husbands or their wives or whatever. The passage into the afterlife is barred from them. It's a point of no return. And sometimes it's an actual physical gate or fence, and sometimes it's a psychological feeling, and sometimes the light is there, and they know, they have this conscious understanding that if they enter the light, they can't go back. So if this is merely psychological, why hasn't somebody crossed the barrier and returned to talk about it? That never happens. So are we psychologically incapable of facing the moment of death, and that's why you don't die in your dreams? You wake up a second before, you go off the cliff or whatever the dream is about. So maybe the brain has no stored knowledge. It has no data that it can use, and it can't make it up. Or maybe it's real and your soul returns. Hard to say. Your soul returns without making a transition. Big question mark here. Chapter 8 is called The Life Review. In 1791, Francis Beaufort, on June the 10th, was a midshipman in the Navy, and he drowned. Except he didn't fully drown, but he sort of drowned, sort of semi-drowned. And we have his writing of that time period. He had perfect recall of this years later. From the moment that all exertion had ceased, a calm feeling of the most perfect tranquility superseded the previous tumultuous sensations. It might be called apathy, certainly resignation, for drowning no longer appeared to be an evil. I no longer thought of being rescued, nor was I in any bodily pain. On the contrary, my sensations were now of a rather pleasurable ease, partaking of that dull but contented sort of feeling which precedes the sleep produced by fatigue. Though the senses were thus deadened, not so the mind. Its activity seemed to be invigorated in a ratio which defies all description. Francis had total recall of those exact thoughts. It really was true that every past incident of my life seemed to glance across my recollection in retrograde succession, not, however, in mere outline, as here stated, but the picture filled up with every minute and collateral feature. In short, the whole period of my existence seemed to be placed before me in a kind of panoramic view, and each act of it seemed to be accompanied by a consciousness of right or wrong, or by some reflection on its cause or its consequence. Indeed, many trifling events which had been long forgotten then crowded into my imagination. What fascinated Francis was that although he had been religiously brought up, all his thoughts were confined to the past and nothing to the future. He was amazed that he saw so much during the space of what cannot have been more than 2 minutes between suffocation and rescue. He described his experience over 200 years ago, long before the first account of near death experiences had been published in the West, and yet the parallels between his account and later well documented experiences are inescapable. Sorry. This person says, I experienced the review of my life, which extended from early childhood and included many occurrences that I had completely forgotten. My life passed before me in momentary flash, but it was entire. Even my thoughts were included. Some of the contents caused me to be ashamed, but there were one or two I'd forgotten about, of which I was quite pleased. All in all, I knew that I could have lived a much better life, but it could have been a lot worse. Be that as it may, I knew that it was all over now, and there was no going back, and there was one most peculiar feature of this life review, and it's very difficult to describe, let alone explain. Although it took but a moment to complete, literally a flash, there was still time to stop and wonder over separate incidents. This was the first instance of distortion of time that I experienced, but it was the beginning of my belief that the answers to many of the questions that are posed by near-death experiences lie in a better understanding of the nature of time and what we term reality. After the life review, I spent some time resting and considering the implications of what had happened. I did not feel that I had been judged except by myself. There was no denying the facts because they were all there, including my innermost thoughts, emotions, and motives. I knew that my life was over, and whatever came next would be direct consequence of not only what I had done in my life, but what I had thought and what had been my true feeling at the time. Good Lord, that's not a happy prospect. Then we have that was the life review. This guy was an RAF pilot, and that's what I just read. Often, you feel the emotional pain that you have caused others, and you are fully aware that it's a lesson, and you determine to do better, but it's not like you're judged so that you can be punished. It's to learn, don't do this again. They did a special study of life reviews, and in 25 to 30% of the cases, and nearly half of these happened during drowning, they got this sort of similar experience. This was a near drowning. I was on a holiday in a small holiday camp with its own swimming pool, and a friend asked me to go in with her. I was not a strong swimmer, but this girl didn't tell me she couldn't swim at all. She jumped in the deep end, went down, and called for help. I tried to save her, but she pulled me down with her. What happened next was remarkable. All my past life and incidents passed through my mind in a flash. Things I had forgotten, right back to about 2 years of age when I was given a rag doll. Then I entered this dark, long tunnel which had this bright, fantastic light at the end. It took me a good while to float to the top, but I made it and entered this wonderful garden full of flowers, grass, shrubs, but it had no sky or birds and was completely empty. But the peace of it all and the brilliant light, much greater than sunlight and darker yellow, more of a gold. I wanted to stay. It was so peaceful. The next thing I remember, a man was over me, had pulled me out of the water, and was working to bring me around. Let's see. So her perceptions of time. This is the next story where the perceptions of time were weird and different, and people will have these touches of things that are happening outside them infiltrate into their near-death experience, but their perception of time as the near-death experiencer is a logical chronology, but it happens in the context in the real world of a few seconds. It's very interesting. Okay, this is it's a weird story. Wait till you hear this. This happened in October of 83. I was relaxing in my armchair with a glass of wine. My mood was very relaxed and happy when my husband, with no warning, attacked me from behind with a 7-pound lump hammer. This attack left me with a depressed fracture of the skull, plus other fractures and bruises. In emergency, nobody considered for one moment that I would live. I was informed much later my breathing and heart did stop. My spirit was high above casualty in another large white room with people who were also in white. These people sat around me, and I seemed to know them, but I can no longer recall who they were. They wanted me to stop fighting and stay with them, and I had achieved what I had been sent to do. They recalled many of the good things I'd done through my life and informed me of the comfort I had given to many of the patients who had died while in my care. They also mentioned the wrong things that I had done in my life. While I insisted that I must return and give my reasons, they assured me that all I had to do would be done from where I was, and at one point they told me to look down at myself. I was warned of the disabilities I would have to overcome, as well as the pain I would have to endure, which would be worse than I had ever experienced, and I said I still wished to return. They assured me that they would give me as much support as possible, but the recovery was up to me, and that I would have to live with what I had achieved. Furthermore, I would also be given new tasks which I would have to do, and told that I could not return if I gave up. The whole time my spirit was away from my body was totally calm and peaceful. Although it sounds as though I was arguing with these spirits, I was not, and neither were they. We were all very calm, and we talked very peacefully. One man did most of the talking. All I can remember of his face were his relaxing eyes, and that he was older than myself. I was 32. The length of time I was in the spirit world has no relation to earth time. I was with the spirit for ages, and there was never any rush, whereas it's clear that I could only have died for minutes in earth time. There's so much rush on earth and so little time. When I regained consciousness 4 days later, I knew exactly what had happened to me, though nobody had told me at the police's request, as naturally they wished to question me. Crime. The neurologists and surgeons say I'm a walking miracle because due to the amount of brain damage I sustained, I should be a cabbage, which I was initially. But due to my spiritual warnings of what to expect, plus their help and their guidance, I now have only a slight paralysis down my right side, which is hardly noticeable, plus epilepsy, which is controlled by medication. I've always told my friends when they felt pity for me because of my disabilities, which were very marked to begin with, and the way my entire life had been shattered initially, yes, I have lost a lot, but due to this experience, I've gained so much more. Her memory of her attack is unusual, and this is why. Head injuries have a memory loss of the time before the event. So if you've ever had a head injury, like my husband fell off the monkey bars in school and landed on his head and was unconscious. And he has no memory of like an hour or more before this actually happened. And he never will, because your brain, when it's traumatized like that, does not permanently store the memories. But she had the memory. So did she see this all when she was out of body? How did she retain this memory? She had terrible, terrible brain damage, really in bad shape. Memories of the life review are not always these big dramatic good and bad moments. She mentions remembering some man she'd seen, some random man she'd seen in a glimpse, a fleeting moment on a bus once, but she remembered that. So this guy near death says that he was dying on his feet, and we all knew it. This is being told by his daughter. So she's talking about her father. I heard him go down to the kitchen very early one morning and put on the kettle, and I joined him, and he said, I've had a very vivid dream, more than a dream it seems. I was walking in the foothills of the Himalayas, where he'd been 35 years previously. And it was the dawn, when suddenly all the dogs of our life, including the dogs of my boyhood, came running to meet me, jumping and wagging their tails as they did to welcome me. I felt younger and stronger every minute, and the light grew behind the mountains brighter and brighter, and I was so happy. And then there was a hand on my shoulder and a voice that said, you must go back, it's not quite time. And I woke up, and I wish I had not had to come back. He asked me not to tell anyone. They'll think I'm finally in my dotage. He died not long after. Interesting. So, life reviews are more common. Life previews are rare. Previews are you're shown what's going to happen. Life review is a psychological need, or is it a psychological need to evaluate and reassess your life and to see that your life has been worthwhile? Are you driven by the psychological need for meaning? Life reviews are much more common in sudden death. People with long illnesses have had time to reevaluate. You often hear of people in an accident. My life flashed before my eyes. There's often an awareness of a choice because there's work to be done and you can go back and finish your work. Unfinished business. Is this a type of limited life preview? So 13% of the people questioned saw scenes from the future. 22% saw scenes from the global future. 48% saw personal things. 48% of the people who saw things saw personal things. And of that group, 29% saw personal future and global future. One man told that he was told that he would write a book, and he seriously doubted it because he was not real academically inclined. Bad speller, not good with words, not into it. And after this near-death experience, at first he was blind and paralyzed. And eventually, he recovered enough where he was partly blind. And right about that time, and he had said, he scoffed, I'm not going to write a book, are you kidding me? But about the time that he started to get some partial sight, computers became common. And as he slowly improved, he slowly wrote, his memory slowly returned, and it's discussed later that that sort of ordered, clear memory that he came out with, how did that come out from a damaged brain? An example of this happening is a guy called Michael who, when he was 18, was in a car crash, and he'd been a very bad student, and he couldn't learn, and he was a disruptive teenager. But that story of him coming slowly to the forefront, getting his sight partly back and being able to write a book, it's not a very common story. But these people do report being given a choice between staying or returning, and if they return, it's going to be a really hard life because of the damage that they've suffered, but they'll be given help to get through it. And it seems like these events are preordained to help some sort of personal development. And there's kind of a contradiction between development and free choice. It's like you can do the personal development if you go back, but you have choice not to. So maybe it's kind of one of those things where you reincarnate and you have this list of lessons to learn and situations you're going to be presented with to help you learn. And you may or may not avail yourself of the opportunity. And in this case, they choose not to avail themselves of the opportunity. So if you take this literally, these memories have to be stored somewhere. The brain's damaged. They can't have been stored in the brain. So that means they had to be stored somewhere outside the brain. But where? Where are they stored? So the book is going to talk about that soon too. But now we're on chapter 9, and that's going to talk about transformation, the near-death experience as a transformative experience. As we read before, 72% of people who had this experience said they felt transformed. 42% were more spiritual. 48% now believed in an afterlife. 22% believed it made them a better person. 40% that they were more socially conscious. 82% lost their fear of death. Even if they had no belief in an afterlife, they still weren't afraid. And most of them felt joy and peace. And they feel they had to tell people who expressed a fear of death. This seems to me like one of the most important jobs that they had when they're told that they have to return. They felt a great drive to share the experience with people who were willing to listen. If somebody else brought up the subject of a fear of death or brought up the subject of a near-death experience, then they felt that they could share it. But it wasn't something they shared with just anybody for fear of ridicule. They felt they were more caring and more sympathetic and impatient with the shallowness of other people in the world. And some felt no change, but many did feel, the ones who felt no change, how do I explain this? The ones who felt no change were the most likely to have already been the kind of people who were in tune with nature and in tune with spirituality, and they've already made part of the journey on their own, I guess is how to put it. And most people, after a near-death experience, whether this was true before, after they believe in some sort of soul existence, most feel a spiritual awakening that has nothing to do with religion and has nothing to do with dogma of any sort. It's completely transcendent from those. They have very broad spiritual beliefs coming out of it, even if they're like, I don't know, fundamentalist born-again people, or like, let's say they're the Duggars. They believe in that cult. If they have this kind of experience, when they come out of it, their understanding of spiritual reality is much more inclusive, much, much broader. They all believe that many paths lead to one truth. No exclusivity in religious experience of an afterlife. It's very rare to see religious figures, as we said before. Your expectation for very religious people would be that they would see religious figures. Some people do, but for the most part, it's a more broad sense of spiritual figure. And there's the sense that you see what you need to see, but that these experiences in general have a universal quality to them. If it was a psychological experience only, it should be strongly culturally influenced, and it's not. So rather than trying to fit the near-death experience into a religious belief system, the near-death experience seems to modify the religious belief system. Very interesting. One guy who was a strict Roman Catholic found that his near-death experience fit more the beliefs of a friend of his who was Hindu, and they shared them. It was shocking to them. And they come out of it feeling sort of special or chosen, and is it only because they survived? Near-death often makes people appreciate the present and the now more than they ever had. So it is a transformative event in a number of ways. It transforms how they have a relationship with religion. It transforms their spiritual sense, transforms how they feel about their soul and about death. It transforms how they feel about themselves. It makes them more compassionate about other people. And it makes them appreciate the here and the now. So the next chapter is on how near-death experiences affect psychic abilities. It's my favorite chapter. I like this. I thought this was really interesting. So this woman says that a very important aftermath of her experience was that it's left me with a sort of heightened awareness. Everything creative, like art, music, literature, people, animals, nature, seem almost too beautiful, touching, or vulnerable. I get such a deep emotional response. Sometimes it seems almost unbearable. And several people said that they had acquired the ability to heal. Often they regard this as a gift given to enable them to pay off a debt, a life for a life, perhaps. This woman said, I've been given the ability of healing, and I'm grateful to be able to help in this small way. Another said the healing power she channels to help people become more aware of their potentialities and strengths. Many report various psychic experiences. They may have strong deja vu feelings and know what's going to happen in the future. This nurse said, I'm not a particularly religious person, but at various times in my life, particularly during adolescence and at times of extreme stress, I've had extraordinary psychic episodes that have been completely uninvited, and in no way do I dwell on spiritualism or try to encourage it in myself. I'm basically a fairly down-to-earth sort of person, a mother of 4 children with plenty of friends and outside interests. Let's see here. How far am I going to read you this? A lot of people are ambivalent about this whole situation. Some places affect me. I'm uneasy. I have never dabbled in any form of spiritualism. I feel that one shouldn't pry. My doctor once told me that he believed I was psychic and scared me witless, this girl says. The other thing I was aware of, which worried me a bit, was that sometimes I know things in advance. I know when people are going to telephone me, or I'll know when they're in trouble and I'll phone them. Sometimes it's just before, sometimes days in advance. That used to worry me, but I've got used to it now and take it as a matter of course. And then this woman said that she noticed that when there was a death in the family, a few days before getting the sad news, I became aware of a strong smell of flowers around me, not noticeable to others, even though she rarely knew that the people concerned were ill to begin with. This other guy says that he has this sense of what's going to happen to people in his life. He knew the exact time of his son's birth. He woke up at the exact time of his son's birth. My question was, what was he doing sleeping during his son's birth? And later, his mother's death. And from time to time, he had deja vu feelings. He also found that he could anticipate major future occurrences in his life. During the near-death experience, saw a speeded-up video of my future life. And it seems that the odd frame in that speeded up video I can remember. And I could foresee some people's destiny, but not everyone's, just people who seem to have a say in my own. That's a good one. This guy says he had surgery and a near-death experience, and a few weeks later, I met a very sensitive and aware person who had no knowledge of what had happened to me, but gave me details and then brought through the entity I'd met during the experience and proceeded to give me details of the next phase of my life. So it puts you in touch with other people who are also psychic. There's often a correlation between head injuries and psychic abilities. Get bumped on the head and suddenly you have precognitive dreams. If you remember the book that I did, Seti, months and months and months ago, if you haven't heard that video, you might be interested. I reviewed a book, synopsized a book called Seti, about a young girl in England who fell down the stairs and was diagnosed dead. Doctor came to the house, declared her dead, wrapped her up and left her. The doctor left to go get official death certificates and order a coffin. And when he came back to the house, she was sitting up in bed eating something, and the family was furious. And he said, no, you have to understand. She was dead. And from that point on, she knew all this stuff about ancient Egypt and spoke ancient Egyptian, and eventually ended up moving there and helping to dig out some archaeology that had been lost, and was able to explain what it was all about. And really interesting. So does consistency, okay, this is chapter 11, looking for a pattern. Does consistency in a story really prove anything? So dreams, they contain everyday life occurrences and near-death experiences. are they all about entirely new experiences? Well, not always. For example, they show this story and say, is this a dream or is this a near-death experience? So this guy got taken to surgery and got pushed down the hall and was really cold, and then suddenly he started hearing music, and the operating room itself was very bright, and there was a doctor in there, a big guy with a beard, wearing a white coat that didn't fit him, and he had a conversation with this old bearded big doctor. And the doctor asked him why he was there, and the patient said that he'd just been brought there and dropped off, and he didn't even know why he was there. And the doctor said that I'm not ready for you yet. Go back to the ward. And he complained. The patient complained because it was cold, and he didn't want to have to go back. But once again, he was taken down back to his bed. So he recalls this conversation that he had with this doctor. And the only thing is, he'd never been taken down to the operating room. They'd never intended on operating on him. Scared it away. Sorry, I was going to sneeze. And it actually never happened. And he had been very ill, though, and unconscious. So they don't know. Is it a dream? Was it a near-death experience? Was going down the corridor like going down to a tunnel? The light in the operating room, the light at the end of the tunnel. Meeting someone who tells you it's not your time, you have to go back. It sure sounds like a near-death experience and kind of masked in this hospital environment. Sorry to use the word masked. We're all sick of it. So, most consistently, looking for patterns, what they find are the more subjective things that happen. The love, the joy, the peace, and the ambivalence about returning to life. An awful lot of this stuff depends on the person. A lot of these near-death experiences vary from person to person, but there are those repeating patterns. And there doesn't seem to be a boundary. Age, gender, class, education, faith. You don't have to have heard about near-death experiences before one happens to you. They happen across all cultures and all time periods. They seem to be 100% universal. And they did some studies with people in India and China, and these are some of their stories. In several Indian cases, the person with the wrong name had the near-death experience and then was sent back. And then later, someone with the same name died. And I guess they were able to document that these two people had the same name and the wrong one had the near-death experience, but the right one died. And often they're taken to a guy who has a record book, like a life review, and they don't have a trip down a tunnel, but they're often escorted. They all often have a phalanx of escorts. Interestingly, people from India don't seem to have the same, now we're generalizing, but they don't seem to have the same feelings like common near-death experiences in the West. And if this were really all the function of a brain, the human brain doesn't care what latitude or longitude it is. All human brains act the same. So if this were completely a biologically, chemically induced thing, all people should experience it exactly the same way with the same emotions. The doctor says, keep in mind, this may be a function of how they've been interviewed. It may be a function of what they are or are not reluctant or culturally willing to speak about, but all things being equal, that would lead one to believe that this is not just about brain function. They did a study of paralyzed earthquake victims in China, and 42% had near-death experiences, which was higher than the percentage they would have expected in the West. but fewer of them experienced the sense of joy or the tunnel or the light. More of them had an experience similar to the Indians. One guy, though, was not a Christian. He'd spent the first 10 years of his life outside China. And he had this experience that, here, let me find it and describe it because it's kind of interesting. So I was in a hospital for 8 months. In the initial period of my hospitalization, I was dead 3 times. At one time, the doctor signed the death certificate, my parents prepared the funeral, and I was sent to a mortuary. During this unconscious period, there was a person wearing a white coat with a pair of wings who picked up my spirit from my body, and we ascended together. Before my ascension, I saw a doctor, nurse, and other staff surrounding and turning my body. I shouted to them that I would come back and asked them not to destroy my body. They couldn't hear me, and I gradually ascended and left them. I came to a place where I had never been, and there was a beautiful sunrise, a big golden plain with sunflowers and other plants, music from distance, tranquil and peaceful feeling. Not sure how long the time that it had elapsed, the angel accompanied me. I was led to a temple which was very dark inside, and looking round I saw a head with white beams shining at its back. The face was not well seen, but a firm, powerful, and solemn voice said to me, "Boy, it's not the place you should be here at this moment. You have to go back to your world." And the boy said, "I'm here. How can I return to my world?" And this voice pointed to a speckle of light, like a star in heaven, and said, "Go back to your world by following the light." And his instructions remain in my heart, and I followed his instructions, and I finally came back to my world, to the hospital, and my body was very weak, very thin, and I could not walk. Now, this is a very Western sort of experience, and they said that what's interesting is he spent the first 10 years of his life not living in China, and that it was later that he returned to China after this experience. So, cultural influences, maybe. Let's talk about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It describes the near-death experience. A bardo is a state. Oh, really good book. Lincoln in the Bardo. Excellent book. I recommend it. It's fiction. So a bardo is a state of living and a state of dying and of becoming. And it's the state of life after death. And it describes the entire life review and the weighing of the soul and what you can expect. Kind of like the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Page am I trying to find here? Okay, I can't read my own handwriting. In the transition from the bardo of dying to the bardo of becoming, there are many parallels to the near-death experience. As dissolution or death dawns, you enter a black experience which has many features of the tunnel. You move into an area of light, a great expanse of light beyond birth or death. After death, individuals stay around the place of death and witness what's happening in much the same way as happens in the out-of-body experience of the near-death experience. They can see living relatives but are unable to communicate with them. The body tends to become idealized, as we have seen happens in some near-death experiences. They can move where they wish and gain perfect knowledge. Wonderful visions are seen and transcendental music is heard. And in some accounts of the bardo, there is a judgment scene very reminiscent of the life review of the near-death experience. Ultimately, all judgments take place within the mind. We are the judge and the judged. Americans report life reviews more than the English do, up to 30% in the United States and 14% in England. Then he mentions this book, which we have done. So we have some videos on this book, Embraced by the Light. So if you want to go back and look at those videos, you don't have to read the book, but it's a really interesting book. It's a good example of somebody whose religious beliefs do influence the experience she has. Then we have a guy called Daniel Brinkley, and he was struck in the head by lightning. Oh, can you imagine? And resuscitated after a cardiac arrest. He went through a tunnel to a spiritual realm where love permeated, relived his whole life, experienced all the grief and pain he caused others, saw himself as worthless, felt the burden of his guilt lifted from him through the love of a being of light. Traveled to a city of cathedrals made entirely of a crystalline substance that glowed with light, that shone powerfully from within. He met 13 beings of light who filled him with knowledge. In the presence of these beings of light, I would become knowledge and know everything that was important to know. I could ask any question and know the answer. The knowledge he was given came in boxes which opened to reveal a tiny television picture to give him glimpses of future world events. How cool is that? And his experience left him with profound psychic abilities so that he could read minds and predict the future with amazing accuracy. It's difficult to, this book was published in 94. His book was published in 94. It's difficult to comment on the predictions that he made. So, you know, can't say if it happened before. He said, oh, the reason I wanted to read this is because he's not entirely correct. He said that there would be, as it went farther into the future, he got less precise. And he said that the world would be in horrible turmoil by the turn of the century. 2 horrendous earthquakes in America, Armageddon around 2004. Maybe we did something right and avoided that. But he said the years between 94 and 96 are critical. And he himself had the power to change the direction of events and avoid Armageddon. He was told how to do this and understood that this was his mission, the reason he'd been shown these visions of the future and allowed to return. So he's not saying what it was he did that saved us all from Armageddon in 2004. Scary stuff. Edie, her message is universal love. Love one another. That's her message. And often the near-death experience is experienced as an awakening and arouses a sense of spirituality, and it's a stimulus for personal development. It happens to children. It used to be believed that it didn't happen to children. It does indeed happen to children. And Dr. Melvin Morse had a 13-year-old patient who nearly drowned and described a near-death experience, and she was able to tell him everything that had gone on with her family while she was trying to drown. And he spurred this doctor, Melvin Morse, into doing a study, and he discovered that of the 11 patients that he asked at random, 7 had had near-death experiences. These are children. And according to Dr. Fenwick in our book, 14% in his study had near-death experiences as children. And often kids have no ability to describe it, no frame of reference for it, and then nobody believes them anyway because they're children, and now you just had a dream. So it's difficult to get accurate reporting from children because so often they're dismissed and they're kind of conditioned to not talk about it. Dr. Kubler-Ross encountered a patient. She had a patient, and this is a really bizarre story. This little girl woke up one morning, perfectly healthy 4-year-old, and told her mother, I'm going to heaven today, and heaven is all gold and beautiful and full of light. And her mother said, well, you had a dream. And later that day, she was murdered. So there's an interesting premonition, precognitive dream. And the kid told her mother the story of going down the tunnel and seeing the light and everything. So children, it's interesting. They don't feel badly about leaving, but they often get drawn back. They're told they haven't completed their life and they need to go back. It's much more common for children to have out-of-body experiences associated with their near-death experience. I'm trying to not read too much out of the book, but it's full of really interesting stories. It's hard not to. I really want to. Let's see. This is interesting. Okay, I'm going to do it. I can't not. It's a girl called Dora. No, I'm sorry. That's the story above. This next story is a guy, 89 years old, and when he was young, he got the flu, 1918. My whole family had it. How my mother kept going, I know not, for she was so ill. We all became so weak, lying in our beds, unable to move, able to drink a little of the water my mother struggled around to give us. Within a few days, we were skeletons. In the boys' bedroom, there were 2 beds, a double near the window where my 2 younger brothers slept, and a single bed for me. We 3 were lying there, unable to move. Yet I did feel myself rise up, float to the highest part of the room, and look down upon myself lying there asleep on my bed. Across to my brothers asleep on theirs. I felt marvelous, no pain, free from ill, floating. But I realized I had a cord linking me with my body below me, and whilst I felt very happy floating there, I somehow knew that if I moved too violently, I would break the cord and I would never be able to return to my body. I decided to return and did. What I experienced was the act of dying, when your soul, the real you, is about to depart from your body. But in my case, I was granted a further spell on earth because I wished to return. Last year, at the age of 88, I had a similar experience in hospital where I'd been taken with a severe heart attack, looking down on the nurses and doctors bending over me, and as I consider I have something else to contribute to life here, I returned and told his story. Let's see. Kids are less likely to have a life review, less of a life to review. They see more strangers because they have fewer people familiar with them who have died. They have a less mystical interpretation of what goes on. It's emotionally neutral. They seem independent of, this all seems independent of brain maturity. They should not be able to go through this, some of them, when they're so young. They actually even have a story of somebody who is, before they were old enough to talk. So the brain is really immature, and yet, wait till you hear this. I was born in 47 at home with no midwife or doctor except a sister-in-law who was helping my mother. My mother was 45 when I was born, and she was crippled with rheumatoid arthritis. I don't know if this had any significance in my birth. However, I was born and apparently did not breathe. It was then that I had this out-of-body experience. I know it may sound absurd that a newborn infant could remember an event when so young, but I know to this day that what I experienced actually did happen to me. The event has had such a profound effect on me that I have always had this fear of dying, which was an awful affliction to have to bear, because logically we all know that to die is the only thing in life that's certain. When I was born, I remember floating onto the ceiling, a nice experience, and then looking down at my body. I can't remember details like wallpaper or anything, but I remember looking down, seeing my mother in bed with me and my sister-in-law. After floating on the ceiling somehow, I don't know how, I found myself in this dark place, climbing frantically up these walls. I had to get past these horrific, horrible, decrepit dead people who were moaning and trying to grab me with their arms. Then I remembered going at great speed down a dark tunnel, heading towards a light, and just as I reached the light, for some reason I came away, and that's all I remember. I was told in later years that when I was born, they thought I was dead. Apparently the doctor arrived to find me blue-black all over. He dipped me in cold water in the bath, and after a couple of tries, I breathed life and cried. This must have been when I came away from the light in the tunnel. I know this happened even though I can't explain how. I can remember an event that happened when I was born, but generally, our memory can only go back to about age 2 or 3. And can you suggest any way I could rid myself of the burden that I carry around every day, namely the fear of death? Isn't that interesting. That's a little bit of a departure from most of these stories. Okay. Chapter 13, The Road to Hell. Yikes. 1982, 67 people said yes, they believed in an afterlife. This is the general population, not experiencers. 27 said no, no afterlife. 70% said yes, they were religious, and 20% said no, they were not religious. 32% of doctors said yes, they believed in an afterlife. 16% of scientists said no. Did you believe in hell? 15% of people said yes. 4% said no. These are doctors. And did you believe in heaven? 24% said yes. 8% said no. So Christians believe 72% in near-death experience. No, I said that wrong. I've got all these graphs in front of me, and I think I'm so clever when I make them, because I make them so that they're simple, and then I don't know what the heck it is I've been doing. So let me rephrase that. Of the people they questioned, of the people who had near-death experiences, what was their religious belief before the experience? 72% went into it were Christians. 85% of those were Catholic. 81% were evangelical. And 85% were Democrats, and Republicans, and 64% were Republicans. 85 were Republican, 64 were Democrat. Okay, now, do they believe in heaven or hell? Christians, 92% believed in heaven and 79% believed in hell. Interesting that some don't. Catholics, 90% believed in heaven, 74% in hell. Evangelicals, this is 96 believe in heaven and only 91% believe in hell. So 17% of the people asked believed in reincarnation. And for Jews, we're not leaving you guys out. The answer is it depends, because there's not that kind of teaching, apparently, in the Jewish belief system. There's no hell. And I did not research the Jewish relationship to the afterlife, and, you know, I get the impression that it's sort of up to you to decide what you want to believe. And that was the result they got from this survey. There was no consistent response from Jewish people. In general, belief in heaven is a lot easier than belief in hell. And there's very few people have a near-death experience that sounds like hell. So do we all feel ourselves that good? Do we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt? Is there a smaller percentage of hell experiences because people don't want to talk about them? Could that be it? I don't want to admit I went to hell, you know. People are haunted or reluctant to talk about them or to write about them. They're equally vivid and as powerful as the good near-death experiences when they have a hell experience, but they're haunted. They don't want to talk about them. And one guy actually had a breakdown after his near-death experience was so hellish. And the question is this a question of perception? There's a common thread through most of these near-death experiences that people are gestured with a helping hand. And do you remember me telling you to remember the tree and the branches of the tree? There's a sense that this is the same as somebody, there's some commonality between that. But then there's the few stories of the grabbing hands of people in suffering, grabbing, kind of like a Dante-esque description. So is this a function of perception? One story of a hand reaching out in help. Is this the same thing, the same process going on as the hands reaching out to grab? It's a matter of perception. Most people see a peaceful mist, but a few people see the steam of hell. So is there a relationship there? So the question is this chemical? Are what we're seeing here endorphins at work? The good endorphins create a positive near-death experience. And there's a story of a drug user being given naloxone, which is an a blocker to morphine. But it also blocks your endorphins. And he had a hellish near-death experience. Was that because he had no endorphins? But of the people who had attempted suicide and come back and had a near-death experience, no negative near-death experience. In fact, the opposite, they felt it gave them purpose. Your mental state in life has no correlation with your near-death experience. And they're not connected in any way, before or after in most cases. You're not, for the most part, now we talked about the one guy who had the breakdown, but for the most part, it's not an indication of your mental health. It's not a reflection of your mental health. And often, rather than having a negative effect, people report that they had a depression that completely vanished after a near-death experience, that it gave them purpose. It gave them a sense of the value of life and a whole different mental outlook, I guess is how you'd put it. The next part, the next chapter is called Let's Be Rational About This. This should be interesting, and I'm going to stop here and upload this video. So this is the end of part 3, I think. I've lost count. And so I'll be back with part 4 here in a second. And I hope that you're enjoying this. I'm finding it absolutely fascinating, and I love how he parses the experience, breaks it down into brain function, psychological function, and spiritual, spiritual cause. I love how he does that, because he's trying very hard to be fair and balanced. He's not jumping to conclusions. And if you get the opportunity, you have to listen to him talk. Very interesting man. Okay, I'll be gone for a second. I'll be back in a minute. And Slanga foil.